The sun was setting over the small southern town, casting long shadows across its quiet streets. Captain Marcus Hayes adjusted his tie in the rearview mirror of his sedan before stepping out into the warm evening air. He had been sent here by the FBI to assist with a major drug trafficking investigation. It wasn't his first time working in a rural area, but something about this place felt different. The town had a reputation for being insular, where everyone knew each other's business and outsiders were often met with suspicion. Still, Marcus reminded himself that professionalism could bridge any gap. He walked toward the police station, a modest brick building with faded lettering above its entrance. His suit was neatly pressed and he carried his badge in one hand and a folder of case files in the other. Despite the calm exterior, Marcus couldn't shake the uneasy feeling growing in his chest. Maybe it was the way people turned their heads as he passed or the silence that seemed to follow him wherever he went. But he pushed those thoughts aside. This was just another assignment, and he'd handled tougher situations before. As Marcus approached the front door of the station, two officers emerged from inside. One was tall and broad-shouldered, wearing aviator sunglasses despite the fading light. The other was shorter, with a scruffy beard and an attitude that radiated hostility, even from a distance. They stopped abruptly when they saw Marcus, exchanging glances before turning their attention back to him. Well, look what we got here," said the taller officer, smirking. "Another city slicker come to tell us how to do our jobs?" Marcus froze for a moment, unsure if he'd heard correctly. He held up his badge and introduced himself calmly. "I'm Captain Marcus Hayes with the FBI. I'm here to assist on the trafficking case." Instead of responding respectfully, the shorter officer snorted derisively. "FBI? Yeah, right. You don't look like no Fed to me." Marcus ignored the jab and tried again. "I've been assigned to work alongside your team. If you'll let me speak with whoever's in charge—" "Oh, we're in charge," the taller officer interrupted, taking a step closer. His tone dripped with sarcasm. "And let me tell you, pal, we don't need some fancy pants guy from the big city coming down here telling us what to do. We know how to handle things around here." Marcus clenched his jaw but kept his voice steady. "I'm not here to take over, I'm here to help, that's all." But the officers weren't listening. Their eyes scanned Marcus from head to toe, lingering on his polished shoes and neatly tailored suit. To them, he looked like everything they resented, someone who didn't belong, someone who thought he was better than them. And worse still, someone whose presence challenged their authority. "You think you can just waltz in here looking like you own the place?" the shorter officer sneered. "What makes you so special?" "I'm not trying to be special," Marcus replied, holding his ground. "I'm doing my job, same as you." The taller officer chuckled darkly. "Your job? Buddy, you ain't got a clue what real policing is. Not in a place like this." By now, a small crowd had begun to gather outside the station. Some passers-by slowed down to watch the exchange, while others lingered nearby, whispering among themselves. Marcus noticed the tension rising but refused to escalate it further. He took a deep breath and tried once more to diffuse the situation. "I understand there might be some misunderstanding," he said slowly. "But I'm here to support your efforts, not interfere with them. Let's focus on solving the case together." His words only seemed to anger the officers more. The shorter one stepped forward, invading Marcus's personal space. "You hear that, Joe? He thinks he's going to teach us something." Joe, the taller officer, grinned maliciously. "Maybe we should show him how things work around here." For a brief moment, Marcus considered walking away. He could call his superiors, explain the situation, and wait for backup. But retreating now would send the wrong message. It would reinforce their belief that they could intimidate anyone who didn't fit their mold. So instead he stood firm, meeting their gaze without flinching. "Listen," Marcus said evenly. "If you have an issue with me, fine. But don't forget, I'm here because this case matters. People's lives are at stake. Is that really worth jeopardizing over some petty disagreement?" His attempt at reason fell flat. The officers exchanged knowing looks, then turned back to Marcus with matching scowls. Whatever respect they might have shown earlier had evaporated completely. Now they saw him as nothing more than an outsider, a threat to their world, And that's when things took a turn for the worse. Suddenly, the shorter officer reached for his handcuffs, snapping them open with a metallic click. "All right, hotshot," he growled. "Let's see those hands." Marcus hesitated, confused. "What's this about?" "You heard me," the officer barked. "Hands behind your back. Now." A chill ran down Marcus's spine. Every instinct told him to comply, but he also knew that giving in too easily could make the situation more dangerous. Instead, he raised his hands slightly, keeping them visible. "There's no need for this," he said firmly. "I'm a federal agent. You're making a mistake." But the officers weren't listening anymore. Their faces twisted with anger, or perhaps fear, and they moved closer, closing in on him. The crowd grew larger, murmuring nervously as the confrontation unfolded. For Marcus, time seemed to slow. Each heartbeat echoed in his ears as he realized the gravity of the moment. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about standing up for what was right, even when faced with overwhelming odds. Little did he know, this was only the beginning of a chain of events that would leave the entire town reeling and change the course of his career forever. The air was thick with tension as the shorter officer, his eyes blazing with defiance, grabbed Marcus by the arm. The sudden movement startled the crowd that had gathered outside the police station. Some gasped, others whispered nervously, but no one stepped forward to intervene. Marcus stiffened at the touch, his mind racing. He knew better than to resist. Any sudden move could escalate the situation further, but he couldn't help the wave of fear and frustration washing over him. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. He had come here to help, not to be treated like a criminal. "Hey, easy," Marcus said, his voice calm but firm. "You're making a big mistake." "A mistake?" The taller officer, Joe, shot back, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "Oh, we'll see about that." Marcus tried to reason with them again, repeating that he was a federal agent and showing his badge for what felt like the 100th time. But the officers brushed it off, refusing to acknowledge its validity. To them, Marcus was just another outsider trying to impose himself on their turf. They didn't care about his credentials or his mission. All they saw was someone who didn't belong, and someone they could bully without consequence. As the shorter officer tightened the handcuffs around Marcus's wrists, the crowd grew louder. Phones were pulled out, cameras clicked, and videos began rolling. People muttered among themselves, some clearly uncomfortable with what they were witnessing, while others seemed to relish the spectacle. Marcus caught snippets of their conversations. "Who does he think he is? They should have run him out of town sooner." It was clear that many in the crowd supported the officer's actions, or at least weren't willing to question them. Marcus's heart pounded in his chest, but he forced himself to stay composed. Panicking wouldn't help. He reminded himself that this wasn't personal. It was systemic. These officers weren't targeting him because of anything he'd done. They were reacting to what he represented. Authority from the outside, change, accountability. And in a place like this, those things were often seen as threats. Things escalated quickly when Joe stepped closer, his face inches from Marcus's. "You think you can just stroll into our town and act like you own the place? You don't belong here, pal. Not now, not ever." Marcus met his gaze steadily, refusing to let fear show. "I'm not trying to take over. I'm here to help solve a case that affects everyone, not just you." His words only fueled Joe's anger. With a sneer, Joe shoved Marcus backward, causing him to stumble. The crowd gasped again, and a few people shouted encouragement to the officers. Marcus regained his footing, his hands still cuffed behind his back. His suit jacket was now wrinkled and his tie hung slightly askew, but he stood tall, determined not to let them break him. "You want to play tough guy, huh?" Joe taunted, stepping even closer. "Well, let me tell you something, you picked the wrong town to mess with." Before Marcus could respond, the shorter officer pulled out his gun, pointing it directly at Marcus's chest. The crowd went silent, the tension so thick it felt suffocating. Marcus froze, his breath catching in his throat. For a moment, everything around him seemed to blur. The faces in the crowd, the sound of distant traffic, the faint hum of cicadas in the evening air. All he could focus on was the barrel of the gun pointed at him, unwavering and cold. "Put the weapon down," Marcus commanded, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. "This isn't necessary." "Oh, it's necessary, all right," the shorter officer spat. "You're under arrest for impersonating an officer of the law." "That's ridiculous," Marcus shot back. "I am an officer. I showed you my badge. Call anyone at the FBI, they'll confirm it." But the officers weren't listening. Their minds were made up, and nothing Marcus said would change that. Joe smirked, crossing his arms as if to say, "What are you going to do about it?" Meanwhile, the shorter officer kept the gun trained on Marcus, his finger dangerously close to the trigger. For several agonizing seconds, nobody moved. The standoff felt endless, each second stretching into an eternity. Marcus's mind raced through possible outcomes. Would they actually shoot him, or was this just meant to intimidate him? Either way, he knew he couldn't give in to panic. He had to stay focused, stay calm. If he lost control now, it would only make things worse. Just when it seemed like the situation couldn't get any more intense, a familiar voice cut through the tension. "What in God's name is going on here?" Everyone turned to see Sheriff Linda Carter striding toward them, her expression a mix of confusion and disbelief. She was a tall, imposing woman with sharp features and an authoritative presence that commanded respect. Her arrival immediately shifted the dynamic. The crowd parted to let her through, and even the two officers seemed to shrink under her gaze. "Sheriff Carter," Marcus said, relief flooding his voice. "Thank goodness you're here. These men—" "Quiet!" Joe snapped, cutting him off. "We're handling this." Linda raised an eyebrow, her eyes narrowing as she took in the scene before her. "Handling what exactly? Why is this man in handcuffs? And why is there a gun drawn?" The shorter officer hesitated, glancing at Joe for guidance. When neither of them answered, Linda stepped forward, her voice firm and unyielding. "Lower your weapon. Now." Reluctantly, the shorter officer complied, holstering his gun with visible irritation. Linda then turned her attention to Marcus, her expression softening slightly. "Captain Hayes, is that you?" "Yes, ma'am," Marcus replied. "I came here to assist with the trafficking case, but these officers—" He trailed off, gesturing to his cuffed hands. Linda's jaw tightened as she processed the situation. Without another word, she ordered the officers to release Marcus. They hesitated briefly, but eventually obeyed, muttering under their breath as they unlocked the cuffs. Marcus rubbed his sore wrists, wincing slightly, but otherwise remained composed. "I apologize for this, Captain," Linda said sincerely. "This kind of behavior is unacceptable. We'll get to the bottom of it, I promise." Marcus nodded, though he wasn't entirely reassured. He knew that apologies were meaningless without action. Still, he appreciated Linda's intervention and hoped she would follow through on her promise. As the crowd dispersed and the officers slunk back into the station, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. What had happened here tonight wasn't just about him. It was symptomatic of deeper issues within the department and the community. And if those issues weren't addressed, they would continue to fester, poisoning everything they touched. Little did Marcus know, this incident would set off a chain reaction that would expose corruption, challenge long-held prejudices, and ultimately transform the town in ways no one could have predicted. But for now, all he could do was take a deep breath, straighten his tie, and prepare for whatever came next. Sheriff Linda Carter's arrival had been like a sudden gust of wind, breaking through a suffocating storm. Her commanding presence and no-nonsense demeanor immediately shifted the tone of the situation. As Marcus stood there rubbing his sore wrists and trying to process what had just happened, Linda wasted no time taking charge. She ordered the two officers who had detained him, Joe and the shorter one whose name was later revealed as Deputy Ray, to step aside. They obeyed reluctantly, their faces flushed with a mix of anger and embarrassment. "Captain Hayes," Linda said, her voice firm but laced with concern, "I want to hear exactly what happened here. Start from the beginning." Marcus nodded, grateful for her calm approach. He recounted the events as clearly as he could, their initial refusal to acknowledge his credentials, the insults, the handcuffs, and finally, the gun being drawn. As he spoke, Linda listened intently, her expression growing darker with each detail. When he finished, she turned to Joe and Ray, her eyes narrowing. "Is this true?" she demanded. "Did you really draw your weapon on a federal agent, on someone sent here to help us?" Joe shifted uncomfortably, glancing at Ray for support. "Sheriff, we thought he was impersonating an officer. He didn't look like any Fed we've ever seen." Linda raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. "So instead of verifying his identity or calling headquarters, you decided to arrest him and point a loaded gun at him? Do you have any idea how reckless that was?" Ray muttered something under his breath, but Linda silenced him with a sharp, "Sir, enough. Both of you are suspended pending further investigation. Go home and wait for my call." The officers exchanged angry glances but didn't argue. They knew better than to cross Linda Carter when she was in this kind of mood. As they walked away, muttering to themselves, Linda turned back to Marcus. Her expression softened slightly, though her jaw remained tight with tension. "I'm so sorry this happened, Captain Hayes," she said sincerely. "This is not the kind of behavior I tolerate in my department or in this town." Marcus appreciated her apology but shook his head. "Sheriff, it's not just about me. What happened tonight isn't an isolated incident. It's part of a bigger problem. If we don't address the root causes, nothing will change." Linda sighed heavily, nodding in agreement. "You're right. And believe me, I intend to get to the bottom of this. But first, let's focus on making sure justice is served for what happened here tonight." Over the next hour, Linda worked tirelessly to document the incident. She collected statements from witnesses in the crowd, reviewed security footage from cameras mounted outside the station, and ensured that all evidence was properly logged. Marcus stayed by her side, answering questions and providing additional context whenever needed. Despite the lingering frustration and unease, he found himself impressed by Linda's professionalism and dedication. She wasn't just going through the motions, she genuinely cared about doing the right thing. As they wrapped up the preliminary investigation, Linda invited Marcus to her office inside the station. The room was small but tidy, with framed commendations lining the walls and a desk cluttered with paperwork. She gestured for him to sit, then poured them both cups of coffee from a pot sitting on a corner table. "I know you didn't come here expecting this kind of welcome," she said, handing him a cup. "But I want you to know that I value your expertise and your integrity. This town needs people like you, even if some folks don't realize it yet." Marcus accepted the coffee gratefully, savoring its warmth. "Thank you, Sheriff. That means a lot. But I have to admit I'm worried about what comes next. Those officers aren't going to take kindly to being suspended, and I doubt they're the only ones with these kinds of attitudes." Linda nodded grimly. "You're absolutely right. Unfortunately, this department has struggled with issues of bias and misconduct for years. I've tried to implement reforms, but change doesn't happen overnight, not in a place like this. People cling to the past because it's familiar, even when it's toxic." Marcus leaned forward, his curiosity piqued. "What do you mean? Has there been a pattern of behavior like this before?" Linda hesitated, as if weighing how much to share. Finally, she sighed and opened a drawer in her desk, pulling out a thick folder marked Internal Affairs Reports. "Take a look at this," she said, sliding it across the desk toward him. Marcus flipped open the folder and began reading. What he found shocked him. Page after page detailed complaints filed against various officers over the past decade. Excessive use of force during arrests, racial profiling, falsified reports, and instances of outright discrimination. Many of the cases had been dismissed due to lack of evidence or buried under layers of bureaucracy. Others had resulted in minor reprimands that did little to deter future misconduct. This is unbelievable," Marcus murmured, flipping through the pages in disbelief. "How has this gone unchecked for so long?" Linda rubbed her temples, looking exhausted. "It's complicated. Some of it's institutional, a culture of silence where officers protect each other no matter what. Other times, it's political. The mayor and city council tend to side with the police union, which makes accountability difficult. And then there's the community itself. A lot of folks around here don't trust outsiders, or the government in general. They see law enforcement as their shield against the other, whether that means criminals or just people who are different from them. Marcus closed the folder, his mind racing. He had suspected there might be underlying issues within the department, but this went far beyond anything he'd imagined. It wasn't just about Joe and Ray. It was about a system that enabled and protected bad actors perpetuating cycles of injustice. "What can we do about it?" he asked finally. "There has to be a way to hold people accountable and rebuild trust." Linda smiled faintly, though her eyes remained serious. "That's where you come in, Captain. You're not just here to solve a drug trafficking case. You're here to shine a light on problems that have been festering for too long. Together, maybe we can start turning things around." For the next several hours, the two of them brainstormed strategies for addressing the systemic issues plaguing the department. They discussed implementing mandatory bias training, increasing transparency through body cameras and public reporting, and establishing independent oversight boards to review complaints. Linda admitted that these changes wouldn't be easy. They would face resistance from officers, politicians, and even some members of the community, but she believed they were necessary. As the night wore on, Marcus felt a renewed sense of purpose. Yes, he had walked into a hornet's nest, but he also saw an opportunity to make a real difference. With Linda's support, he could expose the corruption and push for meaningful reform. It wouldn't be quick or painless, but it was worth fighting for. When they finally called it a night, Linda walked Marcus to his car. The streets were quiet now, the earlier commotion long since faded. Under the pale glow of the streetlights, she extended her hand. "We'll get through this," she said firmly. "Together." Marcus shook her hand, feeling a flicker of hope amidst the chaos. "Thank you, Sheriff, for everything." As he drove back to his hotel, Marcus couldn't help but reflect on the day's events. It had started with hostility and humiliation, but ended with a glimmer of possibility. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but for now, he allowed himself a moment of quiet optimism. Change was never easy, but it was always possible. The next morning, Marcus woke up with a heavy but determined heart. The events of the previous night replayed in his mind like a film reel. He could still feel the cold metal of the handcuffs around his wrists and see the barrel of the gun pointed at him. But more than anything, he remembered Sheriff Linda Carter's promise to uncover the truth. That promise gave him strength as he prepared for what lay ahead. After a quick breakfast at a local diner, where curious glances from other patrons reminded him that news of the incident had likely spread throughout the town, he headed back to the police station. Inside, Linda was already waiting for him in her office, surrounded by stacks of files and documents. She looked tired but resolute, her eyes sharp behind her glasses. "Good morning, Captain." She greeted him with a nod. "I've been digging deeper into those internal affairs reports. There's a lot to unpack." Marcus took a seat across from her, leaning forward attentively. "What did you find?" Linda sighed, pushing a stack of papers toward him. "It's worse than I thought. These aren't isolated incidents. They're part of a pattern. For years, complaints about misconduct have piled up, but most were ignored or swept under the rug. Officers accused of wrongdoing often received slaps on the wrist, or nothing at all. Meanwhile, victims of excessive force or discrimination rarely saw justice. As Marcus flipped through the documents, his stomach churned. One case stood out. A young black man named Elijah Thompson, who had been pulled over for a minor traffic violation, only to end up hospitalized after officers allegedly used unnecessary force during the arrest. The report claimed Elijah resisted, but witness accounts told a different story. Despite multiple witnesses corroborating Elijah's version of events, the officers involved walked away without so much as a reprimand. "This is unacceptable," Marcus muttered, shaking his head. "How does something like this keep happening?" "It's systemic," Linda replied grimly. "When leadership fails to hold people accountable, it sends a message that certain behaviors are tolerated or even encouraged. And when officers see their colleagues getting away with misconduct, they start to believe they can do the same." Marcus set the file down, his jaw tightening. "We need to expose this. Not just for Elijah, but for everyone who's been failed by this system. Linda nodded in agreement. That's why I called in reinforcements. I reached out to the state attorney general's office last night. They're sending investigators to review these cases independently. If we want real change, we need outside oversight. Marcus felt a surge of gratitude toward Linda. He knew how difficult it must have been for her to take such a bold step, especially in a town where loyalty to law enforcement ran deep. Her willingness to confront the truth, even when it meant challenging her own department, spoke volumes about her character. Over the next few days, Marcus worked closely with Linda and the state investigators to piece together a comprehensive picture of the corruption within the department. They reviewed body camera footage, interviewed current and former officers, and spoke with community members who had experienced or witnessed misconduct firsthand. Each new revelation painted an increasingly damning portrait of a broken system. One particularly troubling discovery came from a retired officer named Hank Miller. Now in his late 60s, Hank had served on the force for over 30 years, before retiring in disgrace after being implicated in a cover-up. At first, he was reluctant to talk, wary of reopening old wounds. But once Marcus and Linda assured him that they were committed to fixing the problem, not exploiting it for personal gain, he opened up. The culture here has always been toxic, Hank admitted, his voice tinged with regret. Back in my day, it was all about loyalty to your brothers in blue, no matter what. If someone stepped out of line, you didn't report them, you covered for them. It wasn't about right or wrong, it was about protecting the badge. Hank went on to describe how younger officers were indoctrinated into this mindset early on. Rookie cops learned quickly that questioning authority or speaking out against misconduct would make them targets. Those who tried often found themselves ostracized or assigned to undesirable shifts until they either quit or fell in line. What about the higher-ups? Marcus asked. Did anyone try to stop it? Hank chuckled bitterly. The brass? Most of them turned a blind eye. As long as crime rates stayed low and nobody complained too loudly, they didn't care what happened behind closed doors. And if someone did raise a fuss, like you did, Captain, you became the problem. Marcus leaned back in his chair, feeling the weight of Hank's words. It wasn't just a few bad apples spoiling the bunch. It was an entire orchard rotting, from the roots. Fixing it wouldn't be easy, but every revelation brought them one step closer to dismantling the system that allowed such behavior to thrive. As the investigation progressed, word of their efforts began to spread throughout the town. Some residents praised Marcus and Linda for their courage, while others accused them of trying to destroy the department. Protests erupted outside the station, with supporters holding signs that read, "Justice for all," clashing with counter-protesters, chanting "Back the Blue." The tension was palpable, dividing families, friends, and neighbors. Despite the backlash, Marcus refused to back down. He knew that exposing the truth would be painful, but it was also necessary. During a heated town hall meeting organized to address the growing unrest, he stood before a packed auditorium and spoke directly to the crowd. "I didn't come here looking for trouble," he said, his voice steady despite the murmurs of disapproval rippling through the room. "I came here to help solve a drug trafficking case, and instead, I found something far more dangerous. A culture of fear and impunity that has poisoned this community. What happened to me wasn't personal. It was symptomatic of a larger problem that affects us all. If we don't face it now, it will only get worse." His words struck a chord with some attendees, earning scattered applause. Others booed and shouted insults, accusing him of exaggerating the issue or playing the victim. But Marcus remained unfazed. He had seen enough to know that the fight for justice was never easy, but it was always worth it. By the end of the week, the state investigators had compiled enough evidence to present to the mayor and city council. The findings were staggering. Decades of unchecked misconduct, widespread discrimination, and a blatant disregard for accountability. Faced with mounting pressure from both state officials and the public, the mayor reluctantly agreed to impose federal oversight on the department, a move that many saw as long overdue. For Marcus, the victory was bittersweet. While he was proud of the progress they had made, he knew the road ahead would be fraught with challenges. Rebuilding trust between law enforcement and the community would take time, effort, and unwavering commitment. But as he stood beside Linda, outside the station watching the sun rise over the horizon, he allowed himself a moment of quiet hope. "We're not done yet," Linda said, echoing his thoughts, "but we've taken the first step." Marcus nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "And we'll keep taking steps until this town is a place where everyone feels safe and respected." Together, they turned back toward the station, ready to face whatever came next. The fallout from the investigation rippled through the town like a storm surge, leaving no corner untouched. The mayor's announcement of federal oversight for the police department ignited fierce debates that spilled into every aspect of daily life. Conversations at coffee shops turned heated, social media feeds exploded with arguments, and even church sermons became battlegrounds for opposing views. For some residents, the decision was a long overdue step toward justice. For others, it felt like an attack on their way of life. Marcus found himself at the center of the storm. His name had become synonymous with change, whether people liked it or not. Supporters hailed him as a hero who dared to stand up against corruption, while critics branded him as an outsider bent on dismantling their community. Every public appearance he made drew both cheers and jeers, often simultaneously. At times, the hostility wore on him. He could feel the weight of glares in grocery store aisles or hear muttered insults as he passed by, but he refused to let it deter him. He reminded himself why he was here, not for personal glory, but to help create a fairer, safer future for everyone. Sheriff Linda Carter faced her own share of challenges. Though she had initially been seen as a trusted authority figure, her decision to cooperate with the investigation alienated many within the department, and even some members of the community. Officers loyal to Joe and Ray accused her of betrayal, spreading rumors that she was pandering to outsiders. Meanwhile, critics argued that she should have acted sooner, questioning whether she truly understood the depth of the problem before Marcus arrived. Despite the backlash, Linda stood firm. She held meetings with officers under her command, urging them to embrace the reforms rather than resist them. "This isn't about punishment," she told them during one particularly tense gathering. "It's about accountability and making sure we're serving this community the way they deserve. If we don't adapt, we'll lose their trust forever." Her words fell flat with some, but others began to see the value in what she was saying. A few officers quietly admitted that they'd witnessed misconduct over the years but had been too afraid to speak out. These confessions gave Linda hope that meaningful change was possible, if only they could keep moving forward. Meanwhile, the state investigators continued their work, poring over decades' worth of records and testimonies. Their findings painted a damning picture of systemic abuse. Several officers, including Joe and Ray, were formally charged with crimes ranging from falsifying reports to excessive use of force. Others received suspensions or demotions, depending on the severity of their actions. The news sent shockwaves through the department, forcing everyone to confront uncomfortable truths about their colleagues and themselves. But resistance remained strong. Some townspeople rallied around the accused officers, organizing protests outside the courthouse where preliminary hearings were held. Signs reading "Protect Our Cops" clashed with banners declaring justice over silence. Tensions boiled over during one rally when a group of counter-protesters showed up, chanting slogans like "No justice, no peace." Fights broke out, and police were called in to restore order, a bitter irony given the circumstances. Amidst the chaos, Marcus worked tirelessly to bridge divides. He attended community forums, listened to grievances, and answered questions candidly. He didn't sugarcoat the reality of the situation. Instead, he acknowledged the pain and anger on all sides while emphasizing the importance of working together to heal. It wasn't easy. Some attendees heckled him relentlessly, but he persisted, knowing that dialogue was the first step toward reconciliation. One evening, after a particularly grueling forum, Marcus met with Linda at her office. They sat side by side, sipping lukewarm coffee as they debriefed the day's events. "It's exhausting," Linda admitted, rubbing her temples. Half the time I feel like I'm fighting two battles, one against the system and another against public opinion. Marcus nodded sympathetically. You're doing the right thing, though. Even if it doesn't feel like it now, people will remember your courage later. Linda managed a tired smile. I hope so, but sometimes I wonder if we're pushing too hard, too fast. Change is painful, especially for communities like this one. It is, Marcus agreed. But think about what happens if we stop. Corruption festers, trust erodes, and nothing improves. We can't afford to let that happen. Their conversation shifted to plans for implementing reforms. With federal oversight came new mandates. Mandatory bias training, body cameras for all officers, stricter protocols for handling complaints, and independent review boards to ensure accountability. While these measures were designed to address systemic issues, they also sparked fears among rank-and-file officers about losing autonomy, or worse, being unfairly targeted. To ease those concerns, Marcus and Linda organized workshops led by experts in law enforcement reform. They invited officers to share their perspectives and voice their worries, creating a space for open dialogue. Slowly but surely, some began to see the changes not as threats but as opportunities to rebuild trust with the community. Still, progress was uneven. Some officers embraced the reforms wholeheartedly, attending training sessions and volunteering for outreach programs. Others dug in their heels, refusing to participate or openly mocking the initiatives. One veteran officer named Greg Davis summed up the sentiment of many detractors when he said, "These policies are just political correctness run amok. They'll tie our hands and put us in danger." Marcus addressed such concerns head-on during a department-wide meeting. Standing before a room filled with skeptical faces, he spoke plainly but compassionately. "I understand your frustrations. Nobody wants to feel like they're being micromanaged or judged unfairly. But ask yourself this. How many times has mistrust between law enforcement and the community made your job harder? How many doors have slammed shut because people didn't believe you cared? These reforms aren't about punishing you. They're about giving you tools to build stronger relationships. And trust me, those relationships will make your jobs easier in the long run." His words resonated with some, softening their resistance. Others remained unconvinced, but even small victories mattered. Each converted skeptic brought them closer to real transformation. As weeks turned into months, signs of progress began to emerge. Community relations improved slightly, thanks in part to outreach efforts organized by Marcus and Linda. Officers started hosting neighborhood meetings, walking beats instead of patrolling in cars, and engaging with residents directly. Though skepticism lingered, there were moments of connection. Officers playing basketball with kids at the park, helping elderly residents carry groceries, or simply taking the time to listen to concerns. Yet challenges persisted. The trial of Joe and Ray loomed large, casting a shadow over the entire town. Prosecutors presented overwhelming evidence of their misconduct, including video footage and witness testimonies. Defense attorneys countered by arguing that the officers had acted under duress and accusing Marcus of provoking the incident. The courtroom drama played out in headlines nationwide, turning the case into a flashpoint for debates about policing and racial bias. For Marcus, the trial was emotionally draining. Reliving the humiliation and fear of that night reignited old wounds, but he refused to let it break him. On the witness stand, he recounted the events calmly and clearly, never wavering despite aggressive cross-examination. When asked why he hadn't simply walked away, he replied, "Because walking away wouldn't solve the problem. This isn't just about me. It's about holding ourselves accountable so we can do better." In the end, the jury delivered guilty verdicts on multiple counts, sending shockwaves through the department and beyond. Joe and Ray were sentenced to prison terms, marking a rare moment of accountability in cases involving law enforcement misconduct. The ruling sparked mixed reactions, jubilation from advocates of reform and outrage from those who viewed it as an attack on police authority. Through it all, Marcus and Linda pressed onward, determined to honor the sacrifices made along the way. They knew the fight wasn't over, not by a long shot, but they also knew they had planted seeds of change. Seeds that would take root slowly, growing stronger with each passing day. Late one evening, as they stood outside the station watching the sunset, Linda turned to Marcus with a reflective smile. "You know," she said softly, "when this started, I wasn't sure we'd get anywhere. But look how far we've come." Marcus nodded, gazing out at the horizon. "We still have a long road ahead, but every step counts. Every voice matters." And with that, they returned to work, ready to face whatever tomorrow might bring. Months had passed since the guilty verdicts were handed down to Joe and Ray. The town, once divided by anger and mistrust, was slowly beginning to heal, but scars remained. Conversations about policing and accountability no longer dominated every corner of life, but they hadn't disappeared entirely either. Change, Marcus realized, wasn't like flipping a switch. It was more like chipping away at a mountain, piece by painstaking piece. Sheriff Linda Carter had become a steadfast ally in this uphill battle. Together, she and Marcus had worked tirelessly to implement reforms that would reshape not only the department but also its relationship with the community. Mandatory bias training sessions became a cornerstone of their efforts. Officers sat through workshops led by experts who challenged them to confront their own assumptions and biases. Some officers grumbled under their breath, calling it political correctness, but others walked away with new perspectives. One officer, a young deputy named Sarah Morales, approached Marcus after a session and admitted, "I didn't think I needed this kind of training until today. But hearing some of those stories made me realize how much we've been missing." Body cameras soon became standard equipment for all officers, ensuring transparency during interactions with the public. At first, many officers resisted, fearing the devices would be used against them unfairly. To ease these concerns, Marcus and Linda held meetings to explain the purpose behind the policy, building trust. "These cameras aren't here to catch you doing something wrong," Linda told her team. "They're here to show the world when you're doing things right." Over time, skepticism gave way to acceptance, and some officers even began to appreciate the protection the footage provided when disputes arose. Community outreach programs flourished under their leadership. Officers started hosting regular town halls where residents could voice their concerns without fear of retaliation. These events weren't always smooth. Tensions occasionally flared and old grievances resurfaced, but they created space for honest dialogue. Marcus often attended these gatherings, sitting quietly in the back while Linda facilitated discussions. He noticed subtle shifts over time: fewer angry accusations, more constructive suggestions. People were learning to listen to each other. Again, the Independent Oversight Board proved to be one of the most transformative changes. Composed of local leaders, activists, and ordinary citizens, the board reviewed complaints against officers and monitored compliance with reform initiatives. Initially met with hostility from within the department, the board gradually earned respect as a fair and impartial mediator. When an officer was accused of using excessive force during an arrest, the board conducted a thorough investigation, ultimately clearing the officer of wrongdoing, but recommending additional de-escalation training. Both sides accepted the decision, marking a rare moment of mutual understanding. As the months rolled on, Marcus found himself reflecting on his journey. What had started as a routine assignment had turned into something far greater, a chance to make a real difference. He thought back to that night outside the police station, when he'd stood handcuffed and humiliated, wondering if anyone would believe him. Now, standing beside Linda at another community event, he felt a quiet pride in what they had accomplished together. Still, he knew the work wasn't done. Corruption and prejudice couldn't be eradicated overnight. Vigilance was key. That's why he decided to stay in the town longer than originally planned. His presence served as a reminder that change required sustained effort, and that walking away too soon risked undoing everything they'd built. One evening, as autumn leaves swirled in the crisp air, Marcus addressed a national law enforcement conference. Hundreds of officers, chiefs, and policymakers filled the auditorium, eager to hear his story. He spoke candidly about his experience, the humiliation, the resistance, the moments of doubt, but also the hope he'd found in unlikely places. "This isn't just about one town or one department," he said, his voice steady but impassioned. It's about recognizing that systemic issues exist everywhere, whether we want to admit it or not. Ignoring them doesn't make them go away. It makes them worse. Accountability isn't punishment. It's growth. And growth is never easy, but it's always worth it. His words resonated deeply with the audience. As he stepped off the stage, applause erupted, echoing through the hall. Officers lined up to shake his hand, share their own struggles, and ask for advice. For the first time in a long while, Marcus felt hopeful, not because he believed the fight was over, but because he saw allies stepping forward to join it. Back in the town, life continued to evolve. The protests and counter-protests faded, replaced by quieter forms of activism. Community members formed coalitions to advocate for ongoing reforms, holding both law enforcement and local government accountable. Officers, inspired by colleagues like Sarah Morales, volunteered for mentorship programs aimed at bridging gaps between youth and police. It wasn't perfect. Missteps still happened. Tension still simmered. But progress was undeniable. Linda, too, found herself growing in ways she hadn't expected. Once viewed as merely a figurehead, she emerged as a leader unafraid to challenge the status quo. Her reputation extended beyond the town, earning her invitations to speak at conferences and collaborate with other departments undergoing similar transformations. She credited Marcus for helping her find her voice, though he insisted she'd had it all along. On a chilly December morning, Marcus packed his car, preparing to return to his duties elsewhere. His temporary assignment had stretched into nearly a year, but now headquarters needed him back. Standing beside Linda outside the station, he felt a mix of emotions: gratitude for the friendships he'd forged, pride in what they'd achieved, and sadness at leaving behind a place that had become unexpectedly meaningful. "You'll come back, won't you?" Linda asked, her tone light but tinged with sincerity. Marcus smiled. "Of course, this isn't goodbye, it's see you later. Besides, I want to see how far you take this town." They shared a laugh, then a hug, before Marcus climbed into his car and drove off. As he passed familiar streets and faces, he reflected on the lessons he'd learned. That courage comes in many forms, that change requires patience and persistence, and that even the smallest acts of integrity can inspire others to do the same. The town wasn't perfect. It might never be. But it was better. And sometimes, Marcus thought as he merged onto the highway, better was enough.